digital workplace, the common pitfalls that can stretch out your day and how to tackle them. So over to you, Nicola.
Thank you very much, Elaine. So hello, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Nicola. I was BT's futurologist a very long time ago, but got really fed up with the crystal ball jokes. So my job title is a lot more boring now. I am a principal innovation partner with BT. So I'm part of BT's innovation team. I am currently, of course, standing in my kitchen in Ipswich, which Ipswich is an interesting place. Obviously, we're in the east of England. We're not far from London, but it is the hub of BT's research and innovation organisation. And I'm contractually obliged to put this slide up. So because we don't talk about innovation enough in BT, we're starting to get a bit better, I guess. But a lot of people don't really know that we are the third largest investor in innovation and research in the UK, behind a couple of pharmaceutical companies. Adastral Park, which is about 7 miles that way from my kitchen, is the hub of a lot of the research and innovation activities. But it's, as with a lot of big companies, it's an innovation ecosystem. And what I'm going to talk about today is a very good example of how that ecosystem works, because a lot of the work that I do around the future of work is in conjunction with some fantastic brains in the likes of Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Cambridge University and Lancaster University. And you'll see peppered throughout the presentation some of the incredible insight that we get from those academics. So I am going to talk about the future of work. Again, for those of you who do not know me, I am a slightly weird part of the innovation team in that, as you would imagine with BT, we have a lot of technologists in our research and innovation team. Now, I would probably declare I'm half a technologist, but in actual fact, my background's psychology. So my role is to look at the most disruptive part of innovation, which is, of course, not the technology. It is indeed us. And never more has that been demonstrated than I think the period we've just been going through, because things like homeworking, as I will tell you in a minute, is definitely not new. The technology that underpins homeworking has been available for quite a number of years. Did that mean that we all worked in much more remote and flexible ways? No, it didn't, until a global pandemic hit. So I think a lot of what I'm going to do is reflect on, I guess I regard this as a massive global digital experiment in remote working. And I think one of the things I really want to do in this presentation is to step back and say, well, what worked? What didn't work? What almost worked? And that's where sort of innovation maybe comes in. And where do we think this is going? Are we going to sustain these kind of behaviours? What forces are driving this? And those forces, oddly enough, a lot of the trends that we've been working with over the past, actually 10 years, we've been doing future of work research, so very much before the pandemic. We had identified a number of driving trends, and all of those trends always begin with the letter D, and I've never got any clue why, apart from the fact I'm a huge Sesame Street fan, and I just love presenting and saying this session comes at you by the letter D. So there will be a lot of Ds involved in this presentation. And the first D obviously is disruption. We're having a bit of that at the moment, I would say. I mean, prior to the pandemic, although pandemics were always on that sort of long-term futurists radar, it was one of those ones that people went, well, it's probably never going to happen. And in fact, a lot of the talk prior to the pandemic around the future of work was talking about AI as the big disruptor. So automation, artificial intelligence, that was going to reinvent work. Actually, in fact, it was something a lot more microbial that did reinvent the world of work. So what I've been trying to do is obviously, at the first few months of the pandemic, a lot of tactical stuff we were doing, and now we're sort of looking a little bit more strategically. But because I don't have a crystal ball, I have to rely on data. And the interesting thing is we are starting to get data through on this massive global experiment. So, for example, we are seeing from our network traffic that we're getting slightly different behaviours. For a start, video on our network has gone up fivefold. Things like this are certainly driving that up. We've got the day starting not necessarily at 8 o'clock, which is often when it did in the office. We've shifted it to 9 o'clock because, frankly, we're either having a lie-in or we're making the most of our commutes. Home working had always been, something relatively small. When we look at the pandemic, when it first hit, we got just over 50% of the UK population working from it. Typically, we're getting around a 20% growth in home working. Obviously, not everyone can work from home, and there is a particular segment of worker that has really benefited from this. And it's kind of almost a perfect storm. The technology is there, absolutely. Things like cloud has enabled us to do a lot of that stuff. So, we're getting a lot of really positive vibes back from employees around the working from home piece, although, there's sometimes a bit of a mixed picture, and I'm going to talk a little bit later around the dangers of burnout, because I think we have learned from a long experience in BT of home working that actually long-term home working for most of us is actually quite difficult. And I think most of us are finding that at the moment. And a lot of it's around re-establishing boundaries. But I think a lot of people who can work from home have reported increased productivity, or at least increased perception of productivity. And of course, there's a knockback effect on that as well around employers actually offering a lot more choice and flexibility in their employment packages. Now, again, pre-pandemic, we were seeing a lot of employees saying, I'm looking around for employers that are offering flexibility. Now, we know that there is going to be an economic downturn. We also know that that will have a high impact on employment. Talking to some of the economists, certainly I've been talking to a couple of the guys at Imperial College, the worry they have is that at the top level, with those real, expert skills, there's going to be a lot of competition for the scarce skills, the expert skills. The problem is that most of the unemployment is going to hit the lower skilled workers. So certainly people in hospitality and retail are already being hard hit. The anxiety they have there is that we end up with an even bigger split in terms of our populations, in terms of who's doing well and who's not doing so well. And there are not great consequences of that. So there's some anxieties, I think, that we can also see through employment. But I think, again, that if we're looking longer term, being able to offer flexible and remote working terms is a very attractive proposition for employees. In fact, they will trade their salary for flexibility. So we've got a lot of interesting stuff coming out in terms of our disruption. And obviously, I think the pandemic's going to be around for a while. That's the depressing thing. So disruption's going to be there for a while. There will not be a normal for a very, very long time. And obviously, when we come out of this, we're probably going to get a new abnormal, I guess. But again, one of the trends that we were looking at prior to the pandemic has really kicked in during the pandemic. And one of the MIT professors I was talking to said, the pandemic has actually driven a bullet train through digital strategies, because prior to the pandemic, I worked primarily with corporates in the global and UK space and public sector. I would say that the discussions we were having about digital work with those guys have been accelerated enormously. And I think over the past 6 months, I have seen more change in the digital workplace than I've probably seen in the past 3 to 4 years. So digital work is still a very big priority. Now, my problem with digital workplaces, and pretty much every customer I talk to has a digital workplace initiative. What on earth does that mean? At the moment, it's largely we've thrown technology at the issue. And I think now we're seeing strategists start to say, okay, so we've done the kind of instant tactical solution. How do we take this forward into a much more defined future? And as part of that, we wanted to ask key decision makers around the world, in actual fact, why they were doing digital work. What was the point of the initiative? Now, it wasn't a surprise, and this research we're about to do again, by the way, we're going to be asking customers again around the world on their priorities for digital work and see if they've changed. But largely, it is all about productivity. And that's obvious, if you're going to reinvent the world of work, let's reinvent it to make it more rather than less productive. Okay, brilliant. Now we start to scratch the surface. What is productivity? And this is a big problem because in actual fact, when we look at productivity, the measures that we have around productivity largely were derived in an industrial age. So they were derived for the factory. It was all about inputs and outputs and widgets and well-defined stuff. Now, I don't know about you. I have not manufactured very many widgets today. I've done quite a lot of email, I've done quite a lot of calls, and I'm doing this webinar now. Is that productivity? I think this is a particular problem with jobs that are very suited to home working, because typically those of us who are lucky enough to be able to work from home are largely in the category of knowledge workers. How do I measure a knowledge worker? Well, the trouble is we use proxies for productivity in those measures, the obvious one being the number of hours we work. Now, we know that's not necessarily a good measure of productivity. Actually, the evidence is if we work longer and longer hours, we become less productive. I was talking to an academic, actually not that long ago, about the fact that he reckoned that we could only be physically productive 4 hours a day. So doing 8, 9, 10 hours a day, you're not really being productive. You're just making yourself tired. But that's got a knock-on effect. So certainly for home workers, there is sometimes a paranoia that I have to be always on. And that paranoia, again, comes down to, I'm not sure how to measure people. The 50% figure that we quote on this slide is absolutely the great example of this. So 50% of IT decision makers said that they knew how hard their team was working, not because they could see them in the office. And remember, this was pre-pandemic, but they could see them on IM, because actually largely a lot of workforces were already starting to work in a much more virtualized way pre-pandemic. And obviously now we can't see people in offices. So the only way that we can judge them whether they're working is on instant messenger. Again, that's not a particularly good indication of productivity. That's presenteeism for the digital age. So this is a big question. What is productivity? How do we reinvent it for the digital workplace? Now, I'm not going to answer those questions because they're difficult questions. And I would say that's where we start to throw it over to some of the university partners who have incredibly big brains. And there are a few interesting discussions that we've been having. So with Michael Schrage at MIT Sloan, who is a brilliant guy, by the way, worked with him a number of times before. He's talking about this concept of return on ideas, because if we're knowledge workers, what do? We produce ideas. How do we measure the return on those ideas? Now, I don't know yet, but that's an interesting concept. We've also got a number of discussions around well-being going on, because actually well-being might be a better proxy for productivity than the number of hours worked or the availability of an employee. Because actually, if your employees are working well, the likelihood is they're working productively. So I know Scotland have been having a lot of discussions around this. Iceland, New Zealand, places like that have been looking at correlating well-being with certainly national productivity. But I think if you have any ideas, I am always open to discuss how on earth do we measure this, because measures drive a lot of behaviours. I would say my observation at the moment from the data coming out is that because we drove this bullet train through strategy and we implemented a lot of technology very, very fast, that actually the platforms that we're using have started to bed down now. So a lot of the cloud platforms, the video platforms, the collaboration platforms that we have access to, we've started to learn how to use them and started to maybe, leverage them better. The problem is that often technology moves a lot faster than culture. And I think certainly if you see some of the announcements coming out of one or two governments around the world, notably UK government, saying, get back to the office because you can't be productive at home, can you? That's nonsense, and that's old thinking, because we know from the data that you can be very productive at home. But actually, culture hasn't necessarily moved. So the first thing is that there are some pressures on how you manage remote teams. We know this again during the time of BT. And by the way, our first home working trials were back in 1992. And by about the year 2000, we had a lot of home workers. And like a lot of companies, we kind of pulled back a bit because, again, long-term home working can be really hard to do. But we learned quite early on that you do need to change the way that you measure people and manage people. So Linda Grattan at London Business School, who again I've had the pleasure of working with in the past, has talked a lot around management by trust by default. So in other words, rather than saying I don't trust people to work from home, start from I trust them. Only if I see evidence that I can't trust them do I not trust them. So trust is a default in terms of management style. As I've said before, you probably need to not measure the number of hours people work. You need to give them a piece of work to do, create the purpose for that work, and measure by output, not the number of hours. I do think in the interviews that we've been doing recently with particularly contact centres are giving some quite interesting results around that. So agents who have moved from the physical contact centre at home have actually, most of them, there are some ifs and buts, some of them don't necessarily have the right work environment, but the ones that have embraced it have said they love it, and they don't have some of the problems that their managers have. So in other words, contact centres have a very well-defined job. They work shifts, so they know when they're on, they know when they're off, and they have a very defined work output. In fact, you can measure that output to the nth degree. Their managers and team leaders are struggling. And actually, when you look at contact centres especially, team leaders in contact centres tend to manage by walking around. They see if people are struggling, they do sit by coaching. They can't do that in a normal way now. They have to do that digitally. Now, it can be done digitally, but it does require discipline. It actually requires a little bit more effort than just looking around. Check in and check up with employees. And Christine Derry at MIT has done some really interesting stuff around this new way of management. So very much not micromanaging, but actually just checking in with people to make sure they're okay and checking up that they have everything they need to do their job. That's the remote management style. I think we are finding a few areas that aren't working so well, onboarding being one of the obvious ones. So if you've got a new employee, how do you onboard them? Now, some of that can be done by technology. So we've been working with a company called WalkMe, for example. And what WalkMe does, it's a little widget that just sits on the side of the screen. And when you're using a system, it talks you through a process. So that's a simple technology solution, simply saying, well, press this button, do this field, rather than having to say, I don't know how to use this system, show me. So that's a piece of technology that can do that. That's not going to solve all the problems. So I think, particularly around culture, I get asked an awful lot around how do you do culture remotely? Well, you can. There are companies that are entirely virtual that have culture, but culture often is something you model physically. And that's why office spaces tend to be one of those places where you can visibly see culture. Again, creating that digitally requires effort. It's not as easy, but it is doable. The problem and the anxiety I have at the moment is around what I term the horrible hybrid. Horrible hybrids are, to be honest, one of the reasons why BT pulled back a little bit on our home working strategy, because one of the problems with having a fleet of home workers and a fleet of workers in the office is you can get a them and us culture. And that can be horrible to manage. And even right down to collaboration. We've probably all been there prior to the pandemic. You had a group of people physically in a room, and you were the one or two people that were beaming in virtually. You either got forgotten about or you just couldn't follow what the meeting was about. So we have learnt actually that collaboration, if everyone is digital, if everyone is virtual, works pretty well. And it's a great leveler as well. We've got more of an inclusive culture going on if everyone is digital. But if half of the people in an office space are physically co-located and some of them are not, actually, rather than having a horrible hybrid, you probably need to say, well, everyone is just going to dial in digitally, which then poses the question, why should I be in an office? Good question. And linked to my next D, which I call the death of Dilbert. Now, I'm not going to kill Dilbert because Dilbert is very sweet. I am going to, however, kill his cubicle. This process started prior to the pandemic as well. So I think offices are not dead. There's a big conversation at the moment, and certainly we've got a lot less occupancy going on in many offices at the moment. Again, depending on where you are in the world and what the lockdown status is, we are getting what is nicely termed hokey cokey offices. So you may be in, you may be out. But I think that's making a lot of chief financial officers question, do we actually need an office? Because they're looking at productivity and going, well, we're just as productive, but we've got this real estate. Can we just get rid of it? Now, I think possibly as we look into the future, yeah, we might not need as many offices, but the office, I mean, its primary function is as a collaboration tool because we are social creatures. We like to go into the office to see people, to bump into people, to collaborate, to gossip, all of those things we like doing in an office. And actually, some of those things are much, much harder in the digital space. Now, serendipity is one that I'm having quite a lot of conversations about at the moment because I don't like this concept of I have to be in an office in order to have a serendipitous encounter with somebody. I don't think you do, because I am then restricted to only people in the office in order to bump into them. We have a global network now. I can bump into literally anyone digitally and have a conversation. I think the problem is that we are missing out in the informal conversations that we probably have 10 minutes prior to a meeting and 10 minutes after. And again, not impossible to do digitally, but you just need to think about, rather than having focused meetings and an agenda, do you need a little bit of small talk around them? Because that small talk can be very, very valuable. But I think some of the lessons coming out of the office experiment certainly is around the fact that, well, we may all be on the same ocean here, but we're not all in the same boat. So the first thing is, and I've always said this, for home working to work, you need one critical thing: a home. Now, we have seen from the data that the people that are typically struggling the most with home working, it's obvious really, are people in small flats, in shared spaces that have, I mean, I've talked to a few of our graduates who are working off their ironing board. That's not ideal. So when we look at the go back to office strategies, certainly one of the big priorities is those who are struggling to work from home get a space where they can work. So in the short term, that's one primary function of the office. Harvard have just done some quite interesting stuff on personality type and who's been struggling as well. So it, again, fairly obvious, extroverts are struggling because they like the social contact. People high on neuroticism are very anxious generally about absolutely everything. So again, they're not quite as comfortable working from home. But introverts and people with high levels of agreeableness, and by the way, that's me on both counts, are quite enjoying working from home. And I have to say, I wasn't a home worker before the pandemic. I resisted it. I've studied home working for a very long time. I'm actually really enjoying it now. But we're all different. I think that's the thing. So again, some people are struggling. Certainly parents, up until the point where schools are going back, have struggled when they've had the kids and the whole family, and they're trying to work, they're trying to juggle. That is very difficult. And also the cost of office spaces, when you're looking at reduced capacity, I think typically a lot of organisations I'm working with are looking at 40% capacity in their offices. They've also got to put cleaning and screening programs in to make them COVID safe. We've got this concept of the 2-metre office. So the point of the office being a social space actually is quite difficult when you're looking at COVID safe spaces, because what you're trying to do is separate people out. So have one-way systems, have desks that are further spaced out. So that kind of interaction piece is quite difficult in that kind of office. So for the short term, actually offices are largely for people who can't work from home, who need a secure door to close. So if they're working with secure data, whether it's customer data or simply, something that's very sensitive, or they need specialist equipment to work, which they can't bring home. All of those are the priorities in terms of getting people to the office. So I get rather annoyed about the distinction. Oh, you've got to have home workers and office workers. Actually, it's not office versus home. It's just work. So how do we enable people to work from anywhere? And that anywhere could be a number of choices. Yes, you could work from home. The evidence is that most people want to do that maybe 2-3 days a week, and maybe go into an office of some type for a couple of days a week as well. There are some issues with that. Capacity management will mean that we'll have to be building rotas, again, for the short term. The problem then comes, again, the pre-pandemic stuff that we were looking at, is that most people want to work from home on Mondays and Fridays, which means that offices are completely empty on a Monday and a Friday. And actually what we want to do is to balance out the numbers. So we will need people in on a Monday to Friday rather than concentrate everyone on Tuesday, Wednesdays and Thursdays. So there's that we need to manage in terms of the office. Now, the other office option that I've always talked about and is my preferred option is the office or the co-working space. And again, there's been a lot of discussion about that, bearing in mind also that we have a looming crisis, another crisis coming up behind us, which is the climate crisis. And there's been an awful lot of discussions around, well, rather than having a 2-hour commute into an office, can I walk or ride a cycle to a place which isn't necessarily, a head office or even my office, but is environmentally friendly? So the co-working space, or as I said, I call them offices, that was my preferred way of working because frankly, all I need to work is a coffee, to be perfectly honest. So as long as I can get that kind of space, I'm happy. Again, we're all different. Some people hate that. So I think we've got an interesting picture around, just choices in terms of the office. Could we get completely virtual offices? Well, possibly. But I think the dynamic's starting to change. It is work from anywhere. It's digital by default. And actually, rather than having to ask permission to work from home, I might need to ask permission to work in the office now. Another thing that's come out very strongly from the data, I think, is that leveling piece. So digital is a great leveler. I have a friend who lives in Scotland. She's in a wheelchair. Obviously, traveling down to London is a problem for her. And actually, for the first time this year, she was able to attend a very big AI conference that is typically in London. She was able to go because she didn't need to travel. So that's the first thing. We're enabling a certain population who might struggle to access an office to actually come and fully participate. I've said about personality type, that's another element of diversity. Not everyone is the same. We're seeing introverts actually, because a lot of the digital conversation that's going on doesn't require you to be extrovert and talking in a meeting. Actually, I'm an introvert, so I tend to like writing stuff down and thinking about it and thinking about the language. So we're getting a lot of introverts actually contributing to conversations that they might not have contributed to before. So diversity is always a good thing. And from a future perspective, what we don't want to do is to have an employee population that looks the same and sounds the same and has the same perspective, because we know long term we also need to innovate. Now, innovation and diversity go hand in hand together because you need people with different perspectives and different ideas in order to create innovation. And innovation is one very good way of getting out of a crisis. But there are lots of other things that are going on, and certainly, again, the proven benefits, again, prior to the pandemic, I've listed here. There's all sorts of benefits around just not imposing a one-size-fits-all situation on people. I mean, linked in with that conversation is another D, which is the death of distance. Now, we're a telecoms company, so frankly, we've been trying to kill distance for millennia, really, because that's what we do. We try and get people to collaborate remotely. Does that mean face-to-face is dead? No, and I think, again, some of the lessons we've learned from the pandemic is that face-to-face is pretty valuable, but at the moment, it's almost impossible to do it. But as we get out of this and we get a little bit more choice, I think face-to-face is certainly the easiest way to build trust, for example. Obviously, we've got this shift towards video culture. Now, video culture, again, as an introvert, I didn't like video that much. I've started to get a little bit more used to it and embrace it. But I think we've got a bit of a problem associated with that. When we look at the number of meetings that we've been typically having, we're having more of them. They are shorter and they are typically on video, which actually means that they're slightly more stressful than some of the types of meeting. So there's a camera pointed at me. And again, introverts tend to find it more stressful than extroverts. But the problem is that we're having too many meetings, and this is endemic by the death by meeting days. I had one of those yesterday. I think I was straight back off holiday, 9 o'clock in the morning, started, finished about 4:30, and boy, did I sleep well last night. So we know that that's not good. Now, that is not a problem with the video technology. That is a problem with meetings, and that was a problem prior to the pandemic. It's been magnified by it, because now I don't have to book a room. I don't have to coordinate diaries. I can just have a meeting. And certainly if it makes me look really productive, again, back to the how do I measure productivity? Well, if I have a really full diary, I'm really busy. The problem then is we just have a meeting for meeting's sake. Now, when we look at the lessons that we can learn from organisations that have been remote forever, the thing they tend to do is only have a meeting when they have something to discuss, which means that they do a lot more through asynchronous communication. So whether that's chat or shared environments, so they do their prep. And then when you need a discussion, you have a synchronous meeting. So not so many meetings. Now, I have to say, I usually disagree with Elon Musk. The one thing we agree on is his attitudes to meetings. If there is a meeting in your diary that you don't know what it is, it has no agenda, and you have no idea why you should be there, don't go to that meeting. So that's difficult to do. Certainly I tend to say yes to everything. So that's been quite hard for me to do. But I do think we need to do it, because otherwise we get death by meeting days, and then we just work longer hours. And to my point earlier, that means that we get less productive because we get tired. But so we're having more meetings, shorter meetings. We're also having more meetings with our direct teams. So I think I've had more meetings with my team than I've ever had. The thing that's suffering are the weaker ties. Again, those not so purposeful encounters, those more casual conversations with people who aren't necessarily working directly with us, but really valuable conversations. Yes, it's not the light down. So that sort of stuff, again, not impossible to do digitally, but we do need to think, how do we do that better? And virtual coffees I'm finding great at the moment, just scheduling virtual coffees, virtual conversations, little conversations. Now, these are not agenda driven and kind of go against what I said about meetings. These aren't really meetings. They are just talking to interesting people, just catching up with interesting people. And I'm doing a fair amount of those, and they've been really valuable, more valuable than some of the more formal meetings that I've had to do. Of course, we're talking about the future of meetings, and obviously in an innovation area, we always end up talking about things like virtual reality and augmented reality. Now, those of you who know me will know I am the world's biggest cynic on virtual reality, although there's a great picture there of Nicola Sturgeon and Philip Janssen, our CEO, up in Glasgow, looking at beaming remote lectures directly into your face. I'm not sure I want to do that 8 hours a day. I think there are some very valuable use cases in education and simulation, but do I want that glued on my face all day for meetings? Probably not. So I'm finding augmented reality a lot more compelling. Just some examples here. So firstly, we've been doing a lot with the National Health Service in Birmingham, in the Midlands, around virtual diagnostics, I guess. So this is a paramedic. You can see a paramedic there with an augmented reality headset on. He also has a haptic glove. Now, haptic gloves transmit touch. So what we've got there is a paramedic who literally, with 5G, is transmitting real-time video plus touch to a doctor who actually does have a VR headset on. And the doctor, remote doctor, can literally see through the paramedic's eyes. Now, what we found is that's brilliant in terms of hospital admissions. We can enable the paramedic to do a lot more sophisticated stuff. And pre-pandemic, we were getting a bit of pushback from particularly the doctors going, no, I really need to see the patient. Now everything's, no, we don't want to see the patient. So I think there's a big growth area there around how do we do much more subtle collaboration, obviously enabled by things like 5G. You can also see an engineer there. It's one of our open reach engineers with an augmented reality headset on. I call him a baby engineer. He hates me for calling him that. But what we can do there is we can overlay plans on one eye so he can see through those glasses. Overlay plans. We can even auto-label them because it's standard wiring. So we can use pattern recognition to label those wires. We can have a remote engineer, again, looking through his eyes. So an expert engineer can talk him through a process. Again, we've been using technology like that right down onto the smartphone as well with our consumer engineers. We can actually, with the customer's permission, take control of their camera on their mobile phone. So if they're having trouble with broadband, we can say, well, show us what you've got plugged in. And again, using pattern recognition, we can auto-label wires to make sure that the customer has plugged the right plug into the right socket. And again, that's meant that we haven't had to send engineers out onto customers' premises as much. Now, there's a cost saving there, but again, customers don't necessarily want an engineer stomping around their house. One of the more fascinating ones I posted on Twitter a few weeks ago was we might assume that only white collar jobs are suitable for working from home. It was a fascinating post that I tweeted around some Chinese miners looking. I mean, they're using something that looks a little bit like a games console, but what they're actually doing is mining, driving virtual mining equipment from their home, basically, transmitting it to the vehicles that are doing the mining. So that's a blue collar job potentially being done from home. But I also ought to mention that I went to a conference in augmented reality a few weeks back. I had great fun. You can see me in the centre picture there. I don't quite look like me. I look like a little block with a BT logo on my front, so no natty waistcoats in that one. But the beauty of that conference was it had coffee breaks as well as presentations. So I was able to mingle with the delegates and do that small talk that I said was really missing in a lot of the meetings that we had online. And I have to say, it was the most fun I've had at a conference since I've been doing virtual ones. And I had a lot of really meaningful conversations as well. So maybe augmented reality is the way to go as we go into the future. And even holographic reality is being talked about by the likes of Microsoft. We're into my two final Ds. This one I think is particularly interesting. I've called it the death of Dolly. This is all about the 9 to 5. Yeah, most of us are not doing 9 to 5. We might log on at 9, but actually we might do a couple of hours and then walk the dog or pick the kids up now they're back at school. So all of those kind of things, we're fragmenting our day a little bit more. And as I've said, typically we do tend to see people work longer hours from home. And the problem there is because we're kind of living at work now, it's very difficult to redefine the boundaries that we had when we were going to an office, and we knew that we were working from 9 to 5 because those were the boundaries. So one of the problems, and this is some of the work we've been doing with both Cambridge University and Lancaster University, this is actually Lancaster's work, is that we're trying to maybe elongate our day. We're trying to brain juggle. So we're trying to multitask constantly because we're getting multiple things demanding our attention. Email, we've got calls, we've got stream stress, we've got multiple things being thrown at us, and that's not making us productive. That makes us a lot less productive because our human brain is not built for multitasking. It's a very inefficient way of working, particularly when we're doing complex tasks. We need to concentrate because it takes a while to get back into the thought process. The evidence is between 12 and 20 minutes if you are distracted or are trying to multitask. So there is a case to single task again and maybe turn everything off so that we don't have any distractions. Then, of course, we've had to learn very fast during the pandemic using tools that we've never used before, like video. I think there is an assumption that everyone is technically literate and everyone is comfortable with that. And that's not the case. So I think, again, one thing we've seen during the pandemic is better education tools around how do we do collaboration remotely. And I think we're starting to see programs around how do you lead remotely come in as well. Then, of course, there's that pressure to be always on. And as I've said before, that's not a good thing. You get less productive. So with Cambridge University, we actually did something called the Balanced Business Communication Diet. And it's a diet. It is a 5-step plan to better communications behaviour, whether that's going to stupid meetings that are pointless. Let's not do that. It could be around, if you email me, I'm not going to necessarily give you an instant response because email is a terrible collaboration tool. It's an asynchronous tool. It has its uses, but actually we're seeing a lot more in the chat space going on. So I think, that kind of links back to how am I productive as well. So how do I measure my own productivity? If there's a pressure to be always on, that's quite negative. And then we've got this huge amount of paranoia building up. So there's two aspects to that. The new aspect is economic problems. The fact that we are going to be probably going into a recession. A lot of the economists are talking about a depression as well, depressingly. So people are afraid that they might lose their jobs, and therefore they are trying to demonstrate that they're working hard. Prior to the pandemic, I mentioned it earlier, a lot of that anxiety was about the droid, AI, technology taking my job. There's less anxiety now because I think one of the things that the pandemic has exposed is the weaknesses of AI. It hasn't jumped in to save the world. This again was a study that we did back in 2018, just asking senior execs what they think about AI and robotics. And yes, there was anxiety about, oh my God, is it going to take my job? I am slightly worried that 37% agree that they would rather talk to a robot than their boss. That's a bit of a leadership issue, I think. But in actual fact, the evidence is, and we've always known this, is that machines are good at certain things and not at others. And we're good at certain things, and machines are not good at often the things that we are good at. So machines are very good when there's process and there's data and there's routine and transactional stuff. They are really, really powerful at doing that. We're great at chaos and complexity and innovation and caring and empathy. All of those things we're brilliant at, machines are not good. So I've always hated calling it artificial intelligence because there's not a lot of intelligence there, really. It's more augmented intelligence. So it's humans and machines working together, playing to both of their strengths. And I firmly believe that that's really, when we're looking much more into the future, that's what we are going to be looking at, not machine Armageddon. And I think one of the bad things about economic instability is that the cost of a human reduces. And maybe there's less incentive to put a lot of automation in, versus actually there is, certainly after the financial crisis, there was a real focus on automation. I don't know really on the short term how that's going to go, but I firmly believe that machines cannot take a lot of human jobs because our jobs are not easy to classify or rules based all of that time. And as I said, machines are good where there's data and rules. We can improvise a little bit better. So I think that's good news. It does shift our skill sets a little bit. It emphasizes the things that make us uniquely human, to be perfectly honest, which again could be a good thing. So I want to end on an upward note that I don't think there's going to be techno Armageddon. I do think it's a case of actually making us superpowered by using technologies. So that was a bit of a gallop, I guess, around what we're finding around the digital office, the trends that are driving it, not just short term, and obviously a lot of the tactical stuff that we did in the initial months of the pandemic are now bedding down, where we think things are going medium term, and then obviously trying to look a little bit further out to say what's going to happen in the future. So I think we've got some time for questions. If I stop sharing, I can probably see people if I can work out how to stop sharing.